Rents are still rising. That is what every headline tells you. That is what the government insists. But last week, while most people were focused on GDP numbers and interest rate rumors, something quietly broke inside the UK property market, and almost nobody noticed. The Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors published their February 2026 residential survey. It is a dry document. Bureaucratic language, careful phrasing, deliberately understated conclusions. But if you strip away the careful wording and actually read what the data is saying, the picture is deeply alarming. New buyer inquiries collapsed to -28 in February. That is not a slowdown. That is a cliff edge. In January, the same figure was -17. 1 month. That is how fast confidence evaporated. And when buyer demand falls this sharply, rents do not stay high forever. They follow. They always follow. What this actually means, and why it matters more than any headline you have read this year, is what we are going to break down today. We will cover the real data hidden inside these surveys. We will explain the feedback loop that is now building beneath the surface. And we will tell you exactly what this means if you are renting, letting, or simply trying to hold on in 2026. Let us start with what the official numbers are actually showing. The February 2026 RX survey shows 3 things happening simultaneously. And when you put them together, the picture changes entirely from what the government is presenting. First, buyer demand has fallen off a cliff. New buyer inquiries posted a net balance of -28. That means far more surveyors are reporting falling demand than rising demand. Agreed sales are down. Transactions in January 2026 dropped 6.4% compared to December 2025. And in London, completed transactions fell 47% year-on-year in the final quarter of last year. The RX report diplomatically describes this as subdued market conditions. The reality is, parts of the capital's property market have gone almost completely quiet. Second, and this is the part that connects directly to rents, landlord instructions are falling. The number of private landlords listing new rental properties dropped for the 5th consecutive month. RICS members across the country report that landlord confidence has deteriorated significantly, primarily because of regulatory pressure, rising maintenance costs, and the persistent uncertainty around mortgage refinancing. Since 2022, approximately 148,000 buy-to-let mortgages have come up for renewal each year at rates 2 to 3 times higher than their original deal. Many of those landlords are now selling, not letting. Third, and this is what makes the situation unstable rather than simply difficult, tenant demand has not fallen. It has actually risen. RICS data shows tenant demand ticked up in February, posting a net balance of +14. More people want rental properties, fewer properties are available. The maths of that combination is not complicated, and it does not resolve quietly. What this actually means is that the rental market is now being stretched from both sides at once. Supply is shrinking, demand is rising. And that is before you account for what is happening in the broader economy. Here is the contradiction that nobody in government wants to discuss directly. GDP grew 0.1% in the 4th quarter of 2025. That is the headline. That is what gets reported. But GDP is a blunt instrument. It measures output. It does not measure confidence. It does not measure financial stress. And it does not measure how many people are 3 months away from not being able to pay their rent. Real wage growth has slowed to 1.2% annually, below inflation for most household categories. The Bank of England's own consumer credit data shows that credit card balances rose 8.3% year-on-year in January 2026. That is not a sign of a population feeling economically secure. That is a sign of a population borrowing to cover the gap between what they earn and what life costs. The Institute for Fiscal Studies published a separate analysis in February, showing that the bottom 40% of UK households by income are spending an average of 38% of take-home pay on rent or mortgage costs. For renters in London and the South East, that figure rises above 45%. When a household is spending nearly half its income on housing, it has almost no buffer left. Any disruption, a job change, a health issue, a landlord selling the property can quickly become a housing crisis for that individual family. The reality is that the official economy and the lived economy have been diverging for 18 months. GDP is still positive, but the financial stress underneath that number is building, and the rental market is where that stress is most visibly concentrating. This is not a uniform national story. The data shows sharp regional differences, and understanding them matters whether you are trying to decide where to rent, where to invest, or whether to sell. London is the most exposed. Sales volumes have fallen dramatically. Rental yields, which briefly recovered in 2023 and 2024, are being compressed again as landlord costs rise faster than rents. The private rental sector in outer London boroughs, areas like Croydon, Barking, Waltham Forest, is seeing the highest landlord exit rates. More properties are being listed for sale than at any point since 2009. The Midlands and North West are showing more resilience, but that resilience is starting to fray. Manchester's rental market remains tight, but RICS members there report that the pipeline of new rental stock is critically thin. Birmingham shows a similar pattern. Demand is high, supply is constrained, and rents have risen 9% year on year. But the underlying cause of that rent inflation, landlords leaving, is not a healthy supply dynamic. It is a structural contraction. Scotland and Wales face their own distinct pressures. The Scottish Government's previous rent cap legislation, which expired in 2024, created a suppressed market for 2 years, and rents have rebounded sharply since, up 13% in Edinburgh year on year. Wales is seeing increased property sale to rental conversions in coastal and rural areas as short-term holiday let regulation tightens, but urban rental stock in Cardiff and Swansea remains insufficient for demand. The pattern across all regions is the same at its core. The private rental sector is shrinking at exactly the moment when more people need it. This is where the analysis becomes genuinely concerning, and where official commentary consistently falls short. When landlords sell, the properties they sell are almost never purchased by another landlord. In the current rate environment, buy-to-let borrowing does not work financially for most new investors. The gross yield required to cover a 75% loan-to-value mortgage at current rates is approximately 7.5% to 8% in most regions. In London, actual gross yields average 4.8%. The numbers simply do not work. So when an existing landlord sells, that property leaves the rental sector permanently. The buyer is almost always an owner-occupier, which means one rental home disappears. The family or individual who was renting it must find somewhere else. They enter a market where the number of available properties has just decreased by one, where tenant demand is rising, where rents are already at or beyond affordability thresholds for a significant portion of renters, and where the next landlord selling will repeat the exact same sequence. This is a feedback loop, and feedback loops, once they gain momentum, are extremely difficult to interrupt without direct and significant policy intervention. There is currently no such intervention planned. The government's Renters' Rights Bill, which is moving through Parliament, will strengthen protections for existing tenants. That is genuinely important, but it does not address supply. It does not create new rental properties. It does not give landlords a financial reason to stay in the market. And for the hundreds of thousands of people who will need to find a new rental home in 2026, whether by choice or because their landlord has sold, stronger protections for existing tenants is not the answer to their immediate problem. If you are a renter right now, the most important thing you can do is understand what you are facing. If your tenancy is secure and your rent is manageable, hold it. The cost of moving is not just financial. In many markets, the next available property will be 15% to 20% more expensive than your current rent. Stability has real value in this environment. If you are approaching a renewal and your landlord is increasing rent significantly, do not immediately assume you have no negotiating position. Void periods are expensive for landlords, and in many markets, finding a reliable tenant quickly is not guaranteed. A reasonable counteroffer presented professionally will often be accepted. If you are currently searching for a rental property, particularly in London or major city centres, adjust your timeline expectations. The gap between when a good property is listed and when it is let is now often measured in days, not weeks. Having references, employment documentation, and deposit funds prepared in advance is not optional anymore. It is the minimum requirement to compete. If you are a landlord considering whether to sell, the data suggests the window for maximizing sale price may be narrowing in certain regions. London, particularly, is showing signs of further price softening in the second half of 2026. If your decision is financial rather than regulatory, and timing still matters. And if you are watching this as someone who simply wants to understand what is happening to housing in Britain, the honest answer is this. We are in the middle of a structural shift in the private rental sector, driven by economics that have not yet been resolved by policy. The official data is beginning to reflect what people on the ground have been experiencing for the past 18 months. The market has not collapsed. But the conditions for a genuine crisis are not abstract anymore. They are already here. They are in the numbers. And the question now is not whether it gets worse, it is how much worse and how quickly.